What we're finding is that it's functional.
It's absolutely crucial for the functioning of the entire system.
It's an amazing system. In 2002, the German evolutionist Svante Pääbo was reporting how amazingly complex these genes are. He found only tiny differences in the chimp versus human FOXP2 gene, which is located in the so-called junk DNA.
Okay.
And they thought, you know, it didn't do anything, the evolutionists did, but it actually controls the speech center of the brain.
Which the chimpanzee does not have.
That's right. But, you know, there's only 2 amino acids different between chimps and humans.
In that particular gene.
Which really isn't enough to differentiate why we can talk so fluently and they essentially are mute, just a few, you know, squeaks and chirps and grunts and growls. And Pääbo says it's the gene expression that makes the difference. And I'm not sure I fully comprehend what is involved in that term expression. It's not merely the genes. He said 10% of the human versus chimp genes studied are expressed at significantly different levels in the 2 species. So evidently that is a key. There's a lot more difference between humans and chimps
Absolutely.
than they have been willing to admit to, it seems.
Certainly.
So for a new trait to evolve, you can't just have one gene mutate.
Right.
The regulatory genes that control it would have to mutate as well.
And simultaneously.
Exactly. And this gets way too complex to even imagine how it could have possibly happened. And
Dr. Charles Jackson, our mutual friend, who's been on this program, by the way.
And here's a little diagram of the double helix molecule of the DNA. And it's really a very clever system, you know, with the information on one strand and then the other strand checking it and cross-checking it and so forth, somewhat of a redundant system.
What an incredibly beautiful and splendid design. No leftover parts. We have 4 elemental components, guanine, thymine, cytosine, adenine. Now, those may be strange words to many in the audience, but just 4 basic elemental components which by themselves say nothing. But in combination, they express proteins that make us function. And this is the library index of information. And yet, as we talked at the top of the program, we began as a single cell with a single grouping of this in the nucleus. Yet, it has written into it, encoded into it, the beautiful ability to divide and replicate, the other side being replaced for both of them. Then you have 4 sides or 2 cells.
Well, it minimizes the effect of destructive mutations. It doesn't totally eliminate it, as we'll soon see, but it's a good system nonetheless, as long as the data is not corrupted in the first place.
So these genes are actually the encoding of information that makes that physical body function at the basic level, at the library level.
Well, these are the nucleotide bases, yes. Now, the Institute for Creation Research, very fine research organization, as you know, out in California. A recent article by Professor Daniel Criswell entitled "The Code of Life, Little Words, Big Message," very amply titled. The genes are polyfunctional. He's reiterating that concept, able to produce more than one protein depending on which direction the gene sentence is read or where the gene starts and stops. They help regulate the amount of protein produced by the cell and possibly assist in folding it into the correct shape, functioning shape. DNA is the blueprint, RNA is the contractor, protein is the house.
Oh, yes.
So that's a good analogy.
Good. And
these letters, these 4 bases here, usually labeled by their first letter, you know, A, C, G, and T.
Yes.
For the 4 nitrogenous bases, it says they're arranged in a chain with 2 strands forming a double-stranded molecule. One strand has the coding information, and the complementary strand is used as a template to correct damage or mutations in the coding strand, as
Isn't that beautiful?
Just mentioning. So as I began to be interested in this and start to read it, I ran across a very wonderful book by one of the leading experts and scholars in the world, Dr. John Sanford, previously at Cornell University. True scholar. Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. This is Dr. Sanford here in his book. He's the inventor of the gene gun.
Of the gene gun.
And quite famous, has founded 2 companies, you know, and so forth. And this is a picture here of him. And of course, his bio is pretty legendary. But down here he says, respected Cornell University geneticist John Sanford rejects Darwinism in his recent book I mentioned, and a quote, "The issue of who we are, where we came from, and where we're going seemed to me to be of enormous importance." And I was really taken by this true scholar's sense of perspective of where he is in the timeline of life and things that really matter. He says, "In retrospect, I realize I've wasted so much of my life arguing about things that don't really matter. It's my sincere hope that this book can actually address something that really does matter." So I was even more interested to read it.
And it's a brilliantly written book.
And the whole premise, he says, modern Darwinism is built on what I'll be calling the primary axiom. And here it is. The idea that man is merely the product of random, I might say accidental, mutations plus natural selection.
That's the concept of evolution,
and I
heart
couldn't
and
say
soul.
it any better. A constantly mouthed mantra repeated endlessly on every college campus.
Yes, just repeated. No substantiating evidence, but just repeated. And it's the mantra. It's the dogma.
And the primary axiom is actually an extremely vulnerable theory. In fact, it's essentially indefensible. Its academic invincibility derives mostly from bluster, smoke, and mirrors. Many college students have certainly seen that. If you dare question evolution in the classroom, you're often met with scorn and wrath and intolerance and intimidation.
Normally, yes.
And threat of grade damage, no telling what all. And this axiom is held up by an almost mystical faith, he says. This man ought to know. He's been on the college campus
Certainly.
for decades.
And one of the great inventors.
Exactly.
And a former evolutionist and professor himself.
Right. And it says, which true believers have in this, this mystical faith that they have in the omnipotence of natural selection.
Yes.
And Professor Sanford said he now has a very strong conviction that the primary axiom is most definitely wrong. I say it out loud, the emperor has no clothes.
No clothes. It won't fly, just won't fly.
So by the genome, you had asked earlier, the genome is really a somewhat overarching term that includes the chromosomes, the genes, and the nucleotides, you know, those four bases that we mentioned earlier.
All of this
and the
basic
nucleotides,
structure.
In fact, this is kind of a graphical representation of those bases in sequence, not unlike letters that form words, that form sentences, that form paragraphs, that form chapters, that form books, that form libraries. And those same analogies are right here. The nucleotide bases being the letters, the motifs or clusters are the words, the genes are the chapters, chromosomes are the books, and the genome is the library.
Total genome is the library.
Yeah.
Now, in these last moments, you're making a profound statement that these genes have been designed. And they were, and of course we'll get to the designer. So can you give us, in a nutshell, the statement that you're making?
Well, in addition, he says, to multiple overlapping linear language-like forms of genetic information, the genome is full of countless loops and branches going different places. The genes that regulate, it has genes that regulate genes that regulate genes
that regulate genes.
And again, even the DNA, we found it folds into various shapes, similar to amino acids, proteins that fold to fit like a key going only into one lock.
Yes.
And our bodies, we must remember, contain over 100 trillion cells. And each one has a complete
set of instructions.
Isn't that amazing?
Amazing.
And the mystery is, he says, where did all this information come from and how can it possibly be maintained? It's like a manual of who we are.
Yes.
And the standard evolutionary answer is, well, mutation is where it came from, and natural selection selected those mutations that were beneficial, that conferred some advantage to the organism. And they've created all this biological library of information. Life is life because random mutations at the molecular level are filtered through a reproductive sieve at the level of the whole organism.
Now that's the standard answer.
Standard answer.
But, as Dr. Sanford reiterates in his book and in person, that is a mantra that's repeated and repeated and repeated without substantiation. The emperor has no clothes. It just won't fly.
That's right. So I made a slide here. We've all got holes in our genes. So I put holes in the knees.
Okay. Now give us the answer. Where did it all come from, all of this wonderful information?
Well, he says essentially, if you could show the primary axiom, the foundation is wrong, then our whole current understanding of life would also be shown to be wrong. The current evolutionary understanding.
Yes.
Well, newsflash, random mutations consistently destroy information.
That's
right. What the audience needs to remember is that all mutations always result in a loss of information.
That's right.
And evolution needs a net gain. If you're going to go from pond scum to Einstein, you've got to have some additional information for arms, legs, eyes, ears, brain, things like that.